When I was a kid, there was a series of books I absolutely loved. Each one put you right in the middle of a famous battle, written from the point of view of a young person who somehow ended up at the front lines. First person, right there in the thick of it, watching history unfold through the eyes of a child. That is essentially what this is. You are there, on the ground, during the conflict over the Strait of Hormuz, even though there was no formal pitched battle the way history books describe one. Now, the United States, from everything that has been visible on the ground, was not going to bomb Tehran at that point. That does not mean it could never happen down the road, but at that moment the message from Washington seemed to be, "We warned you, you paid a price, and we consider that settled." Western media was not going to give wide coverage to whatever Iran chose to do in response. But a response was absolutely coming. And sometime the following morning, Trump would very likely step in front of a camera and announce that the Iranians had come to their senses, that America had demonstrated it could not be pushed around, and that there would be a pause in hostilities. A day or two of quiet, maybe, and then the whole thing would heat back up again because the underlying agreement that had been in place had already been violated. From a negotiating standpoint, you were either going to enforce what had been agreed to, or you were not. Trump had mentioned freezing Iranian assets, but those assets had never been unfrozen in the first place, which was something the agreement had called for. So nothing had actually changed, just different words coming out of Washington. Reports at the time indicated around 85 munitions had been used, including roughly 30 ballistic missiles launched from Bahrain and Kuwait. Which raised an obvious question: how were those two locations still capable of launching anything at all, given how many times Iran had struck them over the preceding weeks? The answer, as one of the analysts on the broadcast put it, was that you do not need a large footprint to operate a missile launcher, especially if the equipment had been stored underground and brought out only when needed. Iran would certainly try to target those sites, but the strikes being described that night were not, by any stretch, a serious effort to degrade Iran's military capacity along the strait. The Strait of Hormuz itself is defended in layers that stretch well over 100 miles from the northern end to the southern end. Submarines, underwater drones, surface drones, fast attack boats, some armed with anti-ship missiles, aerial drones, coastal defense cruise missiles, and then deeper inland, more launch sites carrying both short-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles. The United States was not running a strike package capable of dismantling all of that. Not even close. What was happening that night felt more like theater, a performance of strength that had no real effect on Iran's military readiness. Iran had not stopped or even slowed down. And on top of everything else, there were reports that Iran was preparing to lay mines on the Omani side of the strait, which created an entirely new problem, because you cannot send minesweepers in to clear those while coastal defense cruise missiles are still operational, which brought things around to Oman. There had been talks. Oman had met with Iranian officials, and the reporting suggested the meeting had not gone well, that no agreement had been reached. Some reports, which turned out to be coming from Israeli media, claimed that Oman had been open to the possibility of providing safe passage through its own territorial waters, which apparently had irritated the Iranians considerably. When that source was identified, the reaction on air was immediate and fairly blunt. Israeli media reporting on what Iran and Oman had privately agreed to was not exactly the most reliable signal you could find. The broader issue, though, was real regardless of the source. Iran's position was clear and consistent. Ships wanting to transit had to follow established protocols, register in advance, provide the necessary information, and they would be allowed through. That applied to the Omani Channel and the Iranian Channel equally. If Oman was not going to follow that protocol, Iran would simply close everything down. The memorandum of understanding that had been negotiated said nothing about an Omani corridor. It said Iran would be responsible for guaranteeing passage through the entire strait. The whole strait, not just the Iranian portion, not in partnership with Oman. Iran, full stop. If the United States had not wanted that arrangement, it should not have signed the agreement. But it had signed it, and now Washington was trying to add conditions that were not in the text. The only possible outcomes from that position were that the United States accepted what it had agreed to, or the situation kept escalating. On the question of escalation, though, there was a hard ceiling. The United States had entered the conflict with a total inventory of roughly 1,000 ATACMS missiles. Those missiles were no longer in production. They were what the military calls a legacy system. You cannot order more. You cannot restart the line. Whatever was fired that night was gone permanently. The same problem existed with HIMARS rockets. There were plenty of launchers, but the rockets themselves required rare earth minerals that China controls and is not supplying. Rebuilding that inventory was going to take years, not months. Tomahawk cruise missiles had the same constraint. 18 rare earth minerals, all sourced from China, all currently unavailable. JASSM missiles, same story. The United States simply did not have an unlimited ability to keep hitting targets from the air. The ground option was even less viable. If you wanted to put troops on Keshem Island, you were not going to land them amphibiously under those conditions. You would be flying them in on cargo aircraft. A fully loaded C-130 can carry 92 soldiers with full combat gear. A C-17, as large as it is, can carry 123. To put 2,000 soldiers on the ground, you are talking roughly 20 aircraft at minimum just for the initial insertion. And then the question becomes how you keep them alive, because the heat in that region during that period was brutal, and soldiers need water, enormous quantities of water, and water is extremely heavy. The logistics chain for that kind of operation simply did not exist. No ground option, no credible naval escalation, limited and depleting air power. You did not need to be Sun Tzu to work that out. Basic arithmetic was enough. Meanwhile, reports of additional explosions were coming in from Bandar Abbas. A new wave of strikes, or possibly a continuation of the first. The initial assessment was that the strikes were relatively weak in terms of actual damage inflicted, high in volume but limited in penetration depth, not reaching any significant infrastructure, not threatening anything that would genuinely shift the military balance. The timing of Trump's announcement earlier that week had not been lost on anyone paying attention. The threats about massive strikes had come after the stock market closed on a weekday. The following day was a weekend, no trading, and the expectation, at least from one of the analysts on the broadcast, was that by the following evening, before Asian markets opened for the new week, there would be some kind of conciliatory statement from the White House, something designed to signal that the worst-case scenario had been avoided and that the door to negotiations was still open. That prediction, in his view, would hold for 2 or 3 days before the whole cycle started again. The other analyst on the ground in Tehran was not so sure the usual pattern would hold this time. He had spent that day moving around the city, visiting several of the sites that had been struck. The B1 Bridge, the Azadi Sports Complex, a synagogue in a residential neighborhood surrounded on all sides by apartment buildings where Jewish families lived. None of these were military targets. There were no bases there. The dormitories at the sports complex had been hit. The area around the bridge was a place where ordinary people gathered. The synagogue was entirely embedded in civilian life. The conclusion on the ground was hard to escape. When you run out of legitimate military targets, you start hitting whatever is reachable. The people in the streets were processing all of it. A bellboy at the hotel, chatting in the lobby after the sounds had faded, knew exactly what was happening and why. Politically aware, calm in a way that felt less like indifference and more like resolve. His words were simple. He wanted peace, but he did not think a deal was on the table worth taking. Not yet, not under these conditions. That sentiment was widespread. The Supreme Leader's most recent statement had been read in the streets as something close to a battle cry, an acknowledgement of what people had been saying for days, that the response needed to be proportional at minimum, and that patience had limits. Iran was going to respond. That was not in question. The shape of the response would depend on what had been used and where the launches had come from. If the strikes that night had involved air refueling from bases in the region, those bases would become targets. If it was purely missile launches from known positions, those positions would be hit. The details were still coming in. What was also still coming in was clarity about the American military posture overall. Earlier that week, reports had indicated that assets were being withdrawn from the region. B-52s that had been stationed in the United Kingdom returned to the continental United States. A group of F-15 aircraft that had been deployed to Jordan and another base moved to the UK, and now reports of F-22s being pulled as well. A joint special operations task force that had been positioned for a possible mission involving a nuclear site had reportedly stood down. And yet, even as withdrawals were being ordered, countermanding orders were following. Assets told to leave were being told to stay. Assets being held were suddenly being released. The picture, from anyone watching closely, looked like genuine institutional confusion. No clear plan, no consistent command direction. The command and control architecture that would need to be in place for a major combat operation simply was not stood up. That distinction mattered enormously. What was happening could be described as a series of raids. Limited, not sustainable, not penetrating deep into Iranian territory, not targeting significant infrastructure. The kind of thing that produces press conferences and headlines, but does not change the military situation on the ground. The disagreement between the two analysts came down to a single question. Would the United States do something irrational with the limited resources it had left? One view was grounded in logistics. You cannot go to war with a depleted inventory. The commanders responsible for the Indo-Pacific, for Europe, for South America, for Africa, each of them maintain required stockpiles for their own contingencies. You do not drain one command's reserves for the sake of another's political objectives. The institutional friction between commands over resources is not theoretical. It is a daily reality inside the American military, and it has been since long before this conflict started. The United States is also planning, above all other considerations, for the possibility of a confrontation with China. Every major weapon system currently being depleted over Iran is a weapon system that the Indo-Pacific commander is watching leave his inventory. The other view was simpler and in some ways harder to argue against. The United States had already demonstrated a willingness to keep striking with limited resources and limited effect. Not because it was winning, not because anyone in Washington believed the strikes were changing the fundamental balance, but because stopping felt worse politically than continuing. History has examples of that calculus too, and they do not tend to end well. There is a version of this story where the math wins, where the logistics catch up to the rhetoric and the strikes simply stop because there is nothing left to fire. And there is another version where the strikes continue past the point of strategic coherence, sustained by the same force that has sustained a lot of American military adventures over the past several decades. The difficulty of admitting, out loud, in public, that it is over. Which version feels more familiar to you?